There you are, my dear. Come, sit closer. The night is long, but there's no hurry, no rush at all. Let's settle in. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders like a coat shrugged off and left behind at the door. The fire's warm, casting its golden light over us, the crackling wood a soft reminder that all is well, all is safe. Outside the world is quiet, the wind only a gentle whisper through the trees like a friend humming an old familiar tune. Do you know what makes a night truly beautiful? It's not the sky or the stars or even the fire that keeps us warm. It's the feeling of sitting beside someone who makes the world feel softer, kinder. It's the knowledge that at this very moment there is nowhere else to be but here. That kind of stillness, that kind of peace, it's rare. But when you find it, you must let yourself sink into it, like a pebble settling at the bottom of a quiet pond. I remember a night like this, long ago. I must have been no older than 10, curled up beside my grandfather, much like you are now. He was a man of few words, but his presence was like an anchor, steady and unshaken. That evening, I had been troubled by something that, looking back, was small and passing, but at the time it had felt enormous, a weight too heavy for my young heart to carry alone. Sensing my restlessness, my grandfather simply rested his hand on mine. Not a word, not a question, just warmth, quiet and certain. And in that simple gesture, I felt something shift. The knot in my chest loosened, my breath slowed. I realized then what kindness truly was, not grand gestures or loud declarations, but the quiet presence of someone who asks for nothing, yet offers everything. There was an old woman who lived down the road from us, Miss Adelaide. She had a garden filled with the tallest sunflowers I had ever seen, and she used to hum as she tended to them, a melody so soft that the wind seemed to carry it through the whole town. People rarely spoke to her, not out of unkindness, but because they assumed she preferred her solitude. I had always been curious about her, but I never had the courage to go beyond a polite wave. One summer evening, as I was walking past her house, I saw her struggling to carry a heavy bag of soil to her garden. Without thinking, I ran to her side and took the bag from her hands. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with a kind of surprise, as if she wasn't used to being on the receiving end of help. But then, slowly, she smiled, and it was the sort of smile that stays with you for a lifetime. "Would you like to see something beautiful?" she asked. And so, for the first time, I stepped beyond the little wooden gate and into her garden. It was like stepping into another world. Flowers taller than me, their petals glowing in the golden light of dusk, the air thick with the scent of lavender and earth. She led me to the very back, where a single chair sat beneath an old oak tree. "This is my favorite place," she said, sitting down with a soft sigh. "I come here when the world feels too heavy. Here I remember that everything grows, everything changes, and that the smallest kindness can make even the loneliest garden bloom." I sat beside her that evening, listening to her stories, to the laughter in her voice, to the way she spoke about her flowers as if they were old friends. And in that quiet, in that simple exchange, I understood something I had never known before. Kindness doesn't need an invitation. It doesn't ask for recognition. It simply is, waiting in small moments, waiting in the spaces between words, waiting for someone to reach out and share it. And now, my dear, I share this with you, not because I
Sometimes the smallest things, the warmth of a hand, the offer of a quiet presence, are what truly change the world. Breathe in now, slow and deep. Feel the warmth around you. Feel the quiet kindness of this moment. The fire is steady, the night is gentle, and here, in this space, you are safe, you are loved, and when the night grows quiet like this, it has a way of reminding us of the small things that matter most. A kind word, a hand offered without asking, a moment spent in the company of someone who simply listens. But the night isn't finished sharing its stories yet. There is still more to hear, more to feel. So stay with me a little longer, my dear. Let's sit by the fire and let the world slow down just a little more. But the fire is still warm, and the night still hums with quiet stories waiting to be told. So stay here with me a little longer, my dear. There's something special about quiet nights like these, when the world feels slower, softer. The kind of night where you can hear the distant call of an owl, the gentle creak of the old wooden beams, the rhythmic rise and fall of your own breath. It reminds me of another evening long ago, a moment so small, yet it has never left me. Not far from our home, past the tall grass and the winding creek, there was a little shop run by a man named Ezra. He was a quiet man, tall and lean, with hands worn from years of careful work. He made things, little wooden toys, carved animals, trinkets so finely detailed they looked like they might come to life if you only whispered the right words to them. Ezra never had children of his own, but he had a way of speaking to us as if we mattered. I remember saving up for weeks, a few coins tucked carefully into my pocket, just enough to buy a small wooden bird I had seen in his shop window. It had wings outstretched, as if caught in the middle of flight, its tiny eyes carved with such precision they seemed to hold secrets of the sky. The day I finally walked into his shop, Ezra greeted me with that same quiet nod he always gave. I placed my coins on the counter, careful, deliberate, proud. But when he looked at them, he shook his head. "Ah, I'm afraid this one's already been spoken for," he said gently, placing the bird back on the shelf. Disappointment settled in my chest, but before I could turn away, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out something else. A little wooden fox, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, its tail curled as if it had just settled down for a long, peaceful nap. "This one's looking for a home," he said, pressing it into my hands. "No charge. Just a trade, if you're willing." I looked up at him, confused. "A trade for what?" Ezra smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "A promise that one day when you have the chance, you'll pass on something to someone else who needs it more than you." I didn't understand it fully then, not the way I do now, but I nodded, held the little fox close, and thanked him. And from that day on, I carried it with me, a quiet reminder that kindness was never about what you could afford, but about what you were willing to share. Years later, when I was much older, I found myself in a park, sitting on a bench beside a boy who looked lost in thought. He was turning something over in his hands, a few worn coins, the kind of careful count that spoke of deep consideration. I could see it in his eyes, the weight of a choice, the uncertainty of whether what he had was enough. I reached into my pocket, fingers curling around something smooth, something familiar. The little wooden fox, worn soft from years of being held, carried in pockets, placed on bedside tables. Without a word, I held it out to him. "This one's looking for a home," I said. "No charge, just a trade." He looked up at me, surprised.
A trade for what? And for the first time, I repeated Ezra's words, words that had stayed with me all these years. A promise that one day when you have the chance, you'll pass on something to someone else who needs it more than you. He took the fox with both hands, turning it over carefully, and nodded. And just like that, the quiet circle of kindness carried on, stretching beyond me, beyond Ezra, beyond the little shop by the creek. And now, my dear, I share this story with you, because kindness, real kindness, doesn't always make a sound. Sometimes it's a carved wooden fox or a smile given freely. Sometimes it's a hand resting on yours, steady and warm. And sometimes it's simply sitting here in the quiet of the night, knowing you are not alone. So stay with me a little longer, my dear. The fire is still warm, and the night still has more to say. Some moments, my dear, are like ripples in a quiet pond. They start as something small, barely noticeable, but they spread, carrying warmth and kindness farther than we ever expect. A gift given, a promise kept, a hand offered without expectation. These things do not vanish. They live on, passed from one heart to another, changing the world in ways we may never see. I have one last story for you tonight, a story of a man who carried kindness in his pocket, though he never spoke of it, never asked for thanks. His name was Peter, and he ran the old bakery in town, the one with the wooden beams and the bell over the door that rang whenever someone stepped inside. Every morning, before the sky even began to lighten, Peter would wake and knead the dough, shaping loaves of bread with practiced hands. The smell of warm crust and sweet cinnamon would drift through the streets, wrapping around corners, sneaking into homes like an unspoken invitation. But there was something most people didn't know about Peter. At the end of the day, when the bakery was quiet and the last customers had gone, he would gather the bread that hadn't been sold, not to throw it away, not to store it for himself, but to place it carefully in a basket by the door, just beneath the wooden sign that read, "For those who need it." He never spoke of it, never pointed it out. But every night, when the streets were empty, someone would come, a mother with tired eyes, a boy too young to carry the weight he bore, an old man whose hands trembled with age. They would take just what they needed, never more, never less. One evening, I asked him about it. I must have been about 17, sweeping the floors as part of my job at the bakery. I had seen people come and go, had watched them glance around before taking a loaf, as if they feared they might be noticed. "Why do you do it?" I asked. "Why not just give it to them directly?" Peter smiled, wiping his flour-covered hands on a cloth. "Because dignity is a kind of kindness too," he said. "Giving is easy, but giving in a way that lets someone keep their pride, that lets them feel whole, that's something else entirely." I didn't fully understand then, but years later, I found myself in a different town, walking past a little cafe where a small chalkboard sign sat beside the door. It read, "Pay it forward, buy a coffee for a stranger," and next to it, a wall covered in tiny slips of paper. Some were scribbled with names, others with small notes. "For someone who needs a warm drink today," "For a tired traveler," "For a friend I haven't met yet." I watched as a woman stepped forward, hesitating before pulling a slip from the wall. She handed it to the barista, received her coffee, and cradled it in both hands like it was something precious. I thought of Peter then, of the bread left quietly by the door, of the way kindness is not always loud, not always noticed, but always felt where it is needed most. And now, my dear, I share this with you because perhaps one day you will leave something behind for someone else, not for recognition, not for thanks, but simply because you can. And that will be enough. The fire is low now, just soft embers glowing beneath the ash, but the warmth still lingers just as kindness lingers long after the moment has passed. So rest now, my dear. Let the night hold you in its quiet embrace. Let yourself drift, safe and warm, knowing that the world is softer than it sometimes seems. And when tomorrow comes, perhaps you will carry this with you, a small ripple reaching farther than you know,